welcome to our latest edition of Old Testament Introduction class. We are now finishing our tour of wisdom literature. We'll be moving on from the book of Job. We talked about Proverbs. We'll talk about Job. And today, or at least in this video series, we'll be talking about the book of Ecclesiastes, also known as Kohelet in the Jewish tradition. We'll get to why that is in just a moment. Just to start out, just the basic information about the book. I'll get into a little bit of the background here in this first video and talk a little bit about the kind of dominant motif of the book, which is hevel, or vanity, and I'll explain a little bit of the, at least my interpretation and translation of that term. So the name of the book, as I mentioned, is Ecclesiastes in the Christian tradition. In the Greek tradition, it's Kohelet in the Jewish tradition, and in Hebrew. The reason for that disparity, they both actually mean the same thing, or at least they're trying to translate the same thing. Or I guess Kohelet is the word. So the Hebrew word Kohelet comes from the Hebrew word kahal, which means to gather or assemble or collect. Ecclesiastes actually is the same kind of Greek word that means the church, the ecclesia, which means the ones who've been called out, but really means the town assembly, which is another question for another time in New Testament class about why the early Christians decided to call their meetings the town assembly, which would have meant to anyone else like the town council meeting. So in any event, but Ecclesiastes being the one who assembles. The form of Kohelet, if you've taken Hebrew, is Kohelet. It's a feminine participle. Feminine, I say that with stress on it because it's clearly in the book treated as a masculine figure. This person refers to themselves in masculine ways with masculine grammatical categories, but also has this name Kohelet, which is a feminine participle, which means the one who calls out or the one who assembles. It's often been translated into German and then in English by Martin Luther, but others as well as the preacher, Die Prediger, and it's been translated in other ways too. So you'll come across a lot of different ways to try to get at this name, this kind of elusive name. Now, for many people, this is Solomon, right? The issue, though, is that, and I'll get into this historical background a little bit, but it seems to be positioned as if Solomon is the author. But also there seem to be some pretty important clues that Solomon isn't the author. Now, Solomon is like the kind of patron saint. They didn't have patron saints in ancient Israelite religion, but the basic idea of the patron saint is it's someone who kind of embodies a category, right? So the patron saint, in a way, of the Torah is Moses. The patron saint of the Psalms is David, and the patron saint here of wisdom literature is Solomon. The technical term, I guess you could use, is in some way embodiment of the wisdom tradition is the person of Solomon. But we all know that Solomon probably definitely didn't write all of Proverbs. The Proverbs itself has categories within it that say that other people wrote part of Proverbs, but Solomon is kind of the fictive figurehead for it. So in any event, in the same way, Ecclesiastes is associated with Solomon, and in chapters 1 and 2, there's this kind of test almost that this person goes through, this kind of a test about desire and it's like they want to see if they can experience everything, and if that will bring them actually true lasting joy or happiness. And of course it brings them temporary happiness in many ways, but they try to build objects that will keep their name going in perpetuity. These are things that kings would do. So it sounds an awful lot like a king. And of course, the beginning of the book says that it's a king, or at least a son of David in Jerusalem. So it's there is a reference, and it's hinting at being Solomonic. But it's not Solomon. It doesn't say it's Solomon. So chapter 1, verse 1 of Ecclesiastes says the words of the teacher, and this is that word Kohelet, the one who assembles. So it could be assembling people, like calling people out, preaching. It could be assembling wisdom sayings, right? Assembling this book from previous wisdom traditions. So in any event, who knows exactly what that means? But the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. The son of David, that could be anyone related to David, right? A Davidite, just like the sons of Israel are any Israelite, right? So anybody who could claim David as, but then king in Jerusalem, and I'll get to why later in some detail about why I don't think this is actually a king, In part, it seems like in chapter 2 that this is the kind of stuff that a king would do, but then that seems to be kind of put away, almost like chapter 2 is a thought experiment. And then the person who is writing this actually suggests that they are dealing with kings in a subservient position, that they're a scribe. They say things like in chapter 4, verse 13, better is a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king. There's this kind of a story about kingship. But there's even other things like in chapter 8 and so on. Keep the king's command because of your sacred oath. This is chapter 8, verse 2. Keep the king's commands because of your sacred oath. This seems to be advice to another scribe from one scribe to another. The king does whatever he pleases. I mean, so in other words, it's saying that the kings are crazy. You gotta help, work for them, figure out ways to work for them where you don't die. So in any event, this is one of the reasons why people think that Ecclesiastes is not written by Solomon, but it's suggested. It's kind of in the water. But in any event, this is, by the way, just an image of an ancient manuscript of Ecclesiastes that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Ecclesiastes is probably one of the latest books written in the Old Testament. Latest in terms of like the most recent to us. Latest in time. Relative to, say, like Moses or something. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit in terms of the historical context here. We've been talking a lot about these empires in the ancient Near East that kind of dominated at particular times. This is the Persian Empire, map of the Persian Empire. Here's Persia right here. Here's Persepolis, one of the capitals, Susa, another capital of the Persian Empire. And remember, it reached over into this area beyond the river. Here's the Euphrates River, and this is beyond the river, that province, which included Judah or Yehud. This is of course Persia owned Egypt and so on. So at least for periods of their reign, so beyond the river was a buffer zone between Persia and Egypt. Okay, so later on, the Persians lose. If you remember the movie 300, right? There was that famous battle, Thermopylae, right? Where it's the Greeks against the Persians. So Greece over here. And also there were a lot of Greek people living in Anatolia or Asia Minor, what's now Turkey. This area where it included Ephesus and Sardis and so on, which is Asia. Of course, that land bridge right there between Asia and Europe is Constantinople or Byzantium. It's kind of ancient Greek village that becomes a Roman city that's now a Turkish city. In any event, the Persian Empire comes up against difficulties in conquering the Greeks. They conquer the Greeks at certain times, but the Greeks are able to kind of create a confederation between their different city-states that's able to push back. And contain in some ways the Persian Empire. Here are all the states of the Persian Empire. Here again is Yehud in this kind of Ebernari or beyond the river. One of the things that happens in the Persian Empire that's kind of amazing is the creation of money or currency. Here's the derrick. The coinage created the true currency, like actual money, but wasn't really much in use, but still the idea that there were actually coins minted by the king of Persia, and that's the derrick right there for King Darius, who invented this standard. So the people begin using coins. This is a big, massive change, in fact. There's an increase in commerce, in global commerce, in roads that link things together. So commerce and the idea that you're going to kind of make it in the world of commerce is actually growing during the Persian period. And then around 333, 332, and in fact before that, 334, the world changes drastically, radically, in fact, because of this guy right here. This is Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is the son of Philip Macedon, a guy who's from Macedonia, not actually Greece. It's near Greece. They spoke a slightly different language. They were looked down upon by the Greeks. The Greeks didn't think they were very cool at all. However, Alexander becomes the world's best general within a fairly short amount of time. In fact, it's only because he runs out of money. His dad really ran out of money, and then he died, left Alexander with a huge debt. Alexander has to go somewhere to make up this money, and he decides to conquer Persia, the richest country in the world, empire in the world, and decides to take all their money. So he actually succeeds amazingly, which no one would have bet any money on him before he left. So he conquers the Levant in 333 BC, the area around Israel included. He defeats Persia in 331 BC. He defeats Babylon Babylonia in 323 BC, becomes the king of Babylon. He dies not long after. He contracts, it seems, some sort of infection, some sort of disease, or maybe was murdered or poisoned. Who knows? But Alexander dies suddenly at the height of his powers after conquering a vast territory which was unheard of in the history of the world. So it's much larger even than the Persian Empire. He goes all the way to Bactria, which is Tibet. So he conquers into modern-day China. He gets barely across the Indus River into India, and he's conquers Persia, of course, Egypt, and also puts together parts of Europe and North Africa. So, in any event, he has significantly expanded what was understood to be kind of the size of a major empire. And he dies not long after that, and his empire breaks apart into a number of different pieces. Alexander also introduces what we call Hellenization or Hellenism. You'll get to this when you talk in the New Testament course, but basically even Jews all across the land of Israel begin to speak and write in Greek, as well as Aramaic and Hebrew, or Aramaic-ish, Hebrewish stuff. So at the time of Jesus, you have Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew as languages that are all being used to varying degrees within Israel-Palestine. So here, let me move on. So Hellenization is this process of Greekifying. And what Alexander decided to do with his empire was different from previous empires. So the Persians didn't want you to become Persian. If they conquered you, they wanted you to remain whoever you were. If the Persians conquered Jews, they wanted Jews to stay Jews. They didn't want Jews to try to become Persian, to learn Persian. In fact, they didn't try to make you at all learn Persian. They made everyone else learn Aramaic, a standard common language, so that everyone could deal with each other and that the empire could deal with them, but no one would have to learn Persian. They didn't want anyone to dress like Persians, etc. They didn't want people to adopt Persian government styles, of political philosophy and things like this. That was just strange. They didn't want Persian schools to be everywhere. Alexander's different, or at least the people who follow after Alexander are different, but it seems that there was some sort of linkage to Alexander's idea here, although he didn't actually undertake it. There's a huge debate over how this happens, but Hellenization is actually a word coined by Jewish writers that means like Hellenish. Hellenic means Greek. So Hellenic would be Greekifying. This is Greekishifying, so there's within Alexander's empire, and then the subsequent empires that break off from his empire after he dies, and remain Greek-ish. There's a syncretism, a cultural syncretism that occurs where it's not like the Persian Empire, where Persia stayed away from the local cultures and languages, or learned them a bit but kept a distance. Instead, the Greeks welcomed the elite of the people that they have conquered into their culture, into their language. So they teach people Greek. They encourage people to take on Greek political systems. So the system of the city-state, the polis is another word for this. There's the forms of government, self-governance, that you'd find in the Greek city-state. They encourage these kind of Greek colonies. They become Greek colonies to take on Greek names. So in Jerusalem, you find out you eventually get a high priest whose name is Jason. So not a good Jewish name. That's a Greek name right there. You'll find Jews that write in Greek, like Paul, right? Who knows Greek much better than he knows Hebrew, if he knows Hebrew at all. And you find people like this. This is a tombstone right here from the Hellenistic period. So Hellenistic is what we would call this kind of a syncretic, like it's Greek-ish stuff plus local cultures, a variety of local cultures, and it kind of spreads throughout the empire. So Hellenization is this process of the Hellenistic period of Greek culture and language and political systems and theology melding and meshing with a variety of local cultures that they have conquered. And so this right here is a tombstone from a Jew. This is, if you've learned Greek, you can sound this out. This is Aster or Esther. This is a Jewish woman named Esther, and this is her tombstone, and she's got a menorah on there. She has symbols of Judaism. It's also written in Greek. It's a Greek tombstone. So we have a multiplicity of kind of forms of identity that are being combined together here in the Hellenistic period. And this is when we think, Ecclesiastes was written. Now, why would we say this? In part because of the language. Ecclesiastes is written with a very strange vocabulary, a vocabulary that seems to match up really most closely to the Hebrew that was written and spoken around the time of Jesus and later, what's called early Mishnaic Hebrew. So this is like the Hebrew of the early rabbis. That's what Kohelet or Ecclesiastes actually sounds like. It doesn't sound like Moses. It doesn't sound like even the Book of Kings. It doesn't sound like kind of good classical Hebrew. So this is one of the reasons. There's other slight kind of references here and there to certain things or practices. There's one. There's some Persian words which only people would only have known in Israel-Palestine during the Persian period. Before that, Persia wasn't known and the language wasn't known. But then there's also there's not a whole lot of references to Greek culture or Greek philosophical concepts, but there's some resonance between some Greek philosophical concepts and like the Stoics and Ecclesiastes. So all to say that there's this kind of there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that points to this being the period of time. One thing to point out is that here is the sort of fractured parts of, or at least a few fractured parts of Alexander's empire. Really, there's two giant pieces that break off that are important for our purposes here in Old Testament class, but then also in the New Testament class, we'll talk about those. Come back to this period and talk about these folks. Ptolemy was a general of Alexander the Great's, one of his best generals, who ends up after Alexander dies running to Egypt and grabbing that as his territory. And these are the Ptolemaids, or the basically the Ptolemaic Empire. You can see down here the Ptolemies down here. This is Egypt, but it actually goes up into Israel and Palestine, the Levant. And from 300 BC to 200 BC, the Ptolemies run this area. In 200 BC, this empire to the north, called the Seleucid Empire, for Seleucus, another general of Alexander's, who had a dynasty who took over, just like the Ptolemies. By the way, the last of the Ptolemies, that's Cleopatra, who died with Mark Antony when fighting against Octavius Caesar, right? So this is from this family of these Macedonian generals. The Seleucids are another family of Macedonian generals that ends up having a dynasty that lasts a long time. In the year 200 BC, so it's kind of easy historically. 300 BC is when really the Ptolemaic Empire takes over in Israel-Palestine. Hellenism begins in earnest in Israel. 200 BC, the Seleucids take over this territory here and make it their own. But this is the kind of backstory to Hanukkah, which we'll get to on the last day of class. So we'll come back to this history again. So here's a little image of Ptolemy the First here. He's kind of got the Alexander the Great sort of look to him, that is to say, this kind of gaze out into outer space, like he's looking at the gods or something, a little bit disheveled hair. But then also he's wearing the images of Egyptian royalty, the pharaoh's hats. So and then here's another image of the Ptolemaic Empire here in North Africa, and then up into the Levant, but then also a little bits of the Mediterranean as well. So the Ptolemies rule Levant from 300 to 200. Starts out okay, and then it gets kind of progressively worse. Here's a number of images of a number of cities that are Greek cities that they found, and you'll notice that Jerusalem is one. That is, Jerusalem ends up getting refounded as a Greek city, at least for a little while. This is an important thing that we'll come back to later. Jerusalem officially becomes a Greek colony. It's called Antioch in Jerusalem for a little while, and then there's a revolt. So we'll get back to that again as we move on in the class. And this is Ptolemy II and Queen Arsinoe, the queen here. Sorry, I'll minimize myself so I stop getting in the way. But these are important folks. Ptolemy II founds the Library of Alexandria, which you might have heard about, and lots of other cultural institutions and so on. Here's a little map of Alexandria, which becomes a major Greek and a Greek city, but also a major Jewish city. I'll skip some of this just to say, here's a little image of Alexandria. Alexandria becomes the largest city in the world, and also the largest Jewish city in the world, much larger than Jerusalem by the time of Jesus. So at the time of Jesus, there's about 1 million Jews or something, maybe. Between 250,000 and 1 million Jews living in the area around Alexandria, Egypt. I don't know how many are living in Jerusalem at that point in time, but not many. 50,000 maybe at the most. So all to say, Alexandria is much more important than Jerusalem in terms of global Judaism at the time of Jesus, which is kind of amazing. Jerusalem's important symbolically. It has the temple there, etc. But Alexandria is actually where everything's happening. Okay, so here's a little image just to show you Jerusalem in 300 BC. Archaeology tells us that it was a tiny, tiny hamlet at the time of the Ptolemaic Empire. And during that point in time, we think that there were some major crises. One of those major crises, here, I'll move my face up here. One of those major crises was the shift, the radical economic shifts that took place with the Ptolemaic Empire. I won't get too much into detail with that right now, but that's what I'm writing my book on right now. Or maybe I won't get into detail at all with it. So in any event, we're going to come back together and we're going to think together about Hevel, about chapter 1, when we get back after this.